All right, this is the second last essay to read. We read John Hospers, and he's approaching determinism from a slightly different perspective than we've had before. It's from the development, findings, conclusions, assumptions of psychology. So, I've mistitled this. That's interesting. Okay, in any case, psychiatry shows us that your behaviors are determined by your subconscious. Your conscious, the things you're aware of, the thoughts you're aware of, merely rationalizes, that comes up with stories after the fact for why you did what you did. The real motivation was determined by your subconscious. You don't have any access to what was going on that made you make the decisions that you made. He says these are basically the findings of psychiatry. This is clearly seen in neurotic behaviors such as epilepsy, but it's true of all of your behaviors. Suggesting that your subconscious is also one and the same, a part of you with your conscious, does nothing to help the situation, since the kind of freedom people want to think that they have is that their deliberative conscious self is making their decisions. But psychiatry shows us this isn't true. Even the actions one performs voluntarily and with premeditation are the result of invisible to the consciousness of the actor strings from the subconscious. The big three behind the scenes, as he calls it, the id, the ego, and the superego, they determine all. Philosophers have no problem accepting that in certain neurotic cases, kleptomania, schizophrenia, the individual is not free, but is a slave to their subconscious. The science of psychiatry has taught the psychiatrist, though the philosopher has yet to catch up, that this is also the case in all people at all times. So what does this have to do with moral responsibility? He puts it in deductive form. He says, 1, an occurrence over which we had no control is something that we cannot be held responsible for which we cannot be held responsible. Events E, occurring during our babyhood, were events over which we had no control. Therefore, events E were events for which we cannot be held responsible. But if there's something we cannot be held responsible for, neither can we be held responsible for the inevitable consequences, something that result inevitably from those things. Events E have as inevitable consequences neurosis N, which in turn has its inevitable consequences behavior B. Since N is the inevitable consequence of E, and B is the inevitable consequence of N, B is the inevitable consequence of E. Hence, not being responsible for E, we cannot be responsible for B. So he's saying, of course, our behaviors, we're not really responsible for them because what makes them happen are neuroses that develop before we're the age of 5 and usually before we're the age of 3 due to events that happen in our lives over which we have no control. And the neuroses are inevitable consequences of those events, and the behaviors that they make happen are as inevitable as that. So therefore, we're not really responsible for our behaviors because we have no control over why they're happening. Schlick says, you are free when there are no outside forces making you act. If we use this definition, then sure, we're often free. If, however, we take into account compulsions from unconscious internal forces, then the question changes. Some psychologists would say that there are degrees of freedom. That's something that multiple people in this class have brought up. You are free to the degree, the psychiatrist says, according to Hospers, that neurosis is not controlling you, that you're free of your neurosis. Right? He says, as we get healthier, we say we regain our freedom, perhaps, and therefore our responsibility. However, he says, psychoanalysts know that all behavior, good or bad, healthy or neurotic, is rooted in the subconscious. This means that the large portion of your behaviors are not really free at all. Only when you are emotionally disconnected when your behaviors have no real ties to anything important to you, are you maybe a little free? There's a modern day determinist, Scott Adams, who has a number of arguments for determinism, all of which are very good. But he also throws this one in, and we haven't seen this argument of his until we got to Hospers. But essentially, well, although he doesn't talk about the subconscious in the same type of terminology, and maybe he has a different notion there, he still concurs with Hospers that if there's any sort of freedom, it's when you are disconnected, as he would say, from emotions that could possibly be involved in your decision making. Hospers says essentially the same thing. Well, he says exactly the same thing. Only when you are emotionally disconnected are you free of the subconscious, that the subconscious is going to make your decisions for you, whether they're neurotic or healthy. It's the one making the decisions, unless, of course, you're doing something that's totally unimportant, like he says, hailing a stranger in the street, which for some people is not emotionally disconnected. It occurs to me. But also, I think Scott Adams' example is even better. Something like when you're trying to do the arithmetic to balance your checkbook, you can be emotionally free enough when it comes to doing the math, at least, that that perhaps your rationality plays a role. But in basically everything else, you're not free. So again, this is the first determinist we've seen who's taken this psychoanalytic approach. Before we move on to some discussion questions, we've got Paul Ray, and we said, Paul Ray's assumption about the laws of physics and all of that, he doesn't say the laws of physics, but the universal principle of causality that he thinks overarches everything. Everybody in this class seemed to identify that he never really made an argument for that. He really just sort of asserted it as a statement of faith. And William James's criticism that, people on either side of this debate are really just asserting their preference because it's not the sort of thing that can be determined, seems to sting when we think of Paul Ray. I think he lands that blow. The other determinist we looked at was really a statistician and a historical approach. And well, he made some somewhat interesting arguments. I don't think anybody felt like there was that powerful a case being made for determinism in that one. Certainly not as much as in Paul Ray even. But now Hospers gives us a third approach. And this one, I imagine people will find more troubling if they don't like determinism, or more convincing and stronger if they're on that side. What do you guys think about it?
I'd say it's not all-encompassing. I think he doesn't get it right. In my opinion, I think that he is at the core of it. I guess I would say the process he's describing is not incompatible with libertarians, and I think it's only describing the deterministic part that even libertarians themselves concede that like there are deterministic forces. So I think that basically what he's describing is basically Campbell's description of character. So it's like, yeah, you're describing most of the situation, but not all of it. And I think there's one part of it where he was on to something with the concentration camp example, but let's see, I actually wrote something down.
That was still neurosis.
Yeah.
Right. He's arguing about all these neuroses, and then he says, and it's the same with regular behavior. And you're saying, even if it is, that one of the mistakes of determinists is that they think libertarians think most of what a person does is free. But all of the libertarians we've looked at, and everyone who seems to be leaning in that direction in this class, is always suggesting that there are limited circumstances in which there can be agency and freedom, and most of the time it's not like that. So I think you've pointed out a good weakness in Hospers, that he didn't really do much to convince us that this is the case. He more said, well, go to the psychiatrist, they'll tell you it's the case. And so we might want to talk about that a bit. But Are there any other ways? So, in what ways do you think it's possible that there's still some space for a kind of agency, or a limited kind of agency, or an occasional kind of agency, that his statement that everything is psychoanalytically determined by the subconscious, he didn't really demonstrate that?
So, different angles I thought about it from was one, just because he's identifying like a correlation, as we've saw before, it doesn't mean it's causal. So it can be basically just describing, or I wouldn't even say predicting. I think it's just describing, like possibly describing a situation that's happening, but it's not predictive, and or it's not call. I don't know. I haven't thought
You
about
think
that,
that's
but
good?
it's yeah, it's at least not causal in my opinion. It's not causal of all behavior. Another element to consider is that now I'm not like a psychologist or anything, but uh, at least probably in the time that he wrote this, well, I think much has been written since, and I don't think that Freud is held in the same esteem that he was like a long time ago. And I mean, I know a few psychologists, and I hear the impression I get from them is that Freud was on to something. He had some things he was probably right about, but a lot of it was like kind of not, like that's just outdated stuff. And at least from what I gathered from them, and as I'm reading it, it's like, okay, this kind of the big three framework of the ID, superego, and the ego. It's like, is that really how it works? Maybe that's like kind of accurate, but it's probably like a not all-encompassing framework. And so the way that he interprets, for instance, the concentration camp example is not actually what's going on, but it's like there's this overlap where it's like, okay, that's an example where it looks like it's kind of accurate, but it's not. It won't work in other examples.
Yeah. So so there's a few really strong criticisms there. The first one is this: how do we know if a psychoanalytic theory isn't a just so story? I mean, you're giving me a story after the fact. Why don't I look at the evidence of the concentration camp example that he gave, the compulsive washer who got put in a concentration camp and then received enough external punishment that his own subconscious didn't have to torture him anymore. And so he slid into his true inclination to be filthy rather than to be a compulsive washer. And that's a nice story. Here's another story. Well, let's take the Viktor Frankl concentration camp lens and say, um, the man was washing his hands because he had a deep and profound sense of the purpose of his life, and he didn't want germs to get in the way, and it was a neurosis and it was a compulsion and whatever. But what happened in the concentration camp is that he lost his sense of life being meaningful and then gave up every part of his character, including the neurosis. There's a just so story that contradicts the inner mechanisms that are theorized about in the other just so story, right? The Hospers story is that well, we already said it. It's that he was trying to punish, his subconscious was trying to punish him, and then once he had enough external punishment, the subconscious didn't need to do that enough. I'm not sure that's how the subconscious works, first of all, but even if it is, do we have any way of determining which of those two just so stories is correct, or if neither of them are correct and a totally different one is correct? We would have to study psychoanalysis to try to enter into that debate, right? We'd have to enter into that field to do that debate. But certainly what Hospers is offering there is not, um, somebody could say, well, from the Viktor Frankl perspective, the conscious part of the man and the unconscious part of the man who was in the concentration camp had given up on life being meaningful, and that doing anything to preserve it seemed pointless. And so, he gave up on his dreams and his hopes and his vision for the future, and also the compulsive washing, which was a part of helping to preserve his ability to get to his aims that he used to have. And maybe the compulsive washing was still a neurosis, but it went when everything else went. So the idea is, have you really proved that the subconscious is determining everything here? And also, you're making up a bunch of stuff about what's going on, but you don't have any access to what's going on in his brain any more than he does, at least not with the evidence that you presented, at least. So that's a good criticism. The other criticism you voiced on this, I thought was very good, is the idea that, okay, let's imagine it this way. To be a psychoanalyst is to be a scientist, which means that you have to limit your language to the things that you can actually talk about. Well, what can you talk about? You can only talk about things that when you present them will force your peers to agree with you. In other words, your approach from the beginning might force you not to consider something like agency. Right? That's not something you could see in a microscope or a telescope or put on a scale. And so you're not really allowed to talk about something like that because your peers will demand evidence and you won't have any evidence. But that doesn't prove that there is no such thing. It just proves that the language you've chosen to try to comprehend things is a limited language that won't allow you to consider certain possibilities. So again, it's an example of what we talked about before, the scientism mistake. The idea that says, I'm going to limit my considerations to certain things. I'm going to objectify the world and only consider things that are external to myself that I can model as objects measurable and make predictions about them. Well, great. That's a very powerful language, and you can build a rocket ship and an iPad if you do that. But like you pointed out, it's a limiting language approach, which is what makes it powerful, right? The rules of chess limit what you can do in chess, but they also make brilliant and beautiful games possible. So what makes science powerful isn't necessarily something that science proves is true. It's just a necessary assumption it has to make in order to start its game. But the fact that science is effective, I don't think also reverse engineers back into everything I had to assume to do my science must therefore be true, the total story. So those were two good criticisms that you pointed at in this piece. You had a third one, if I can remember correctly now, what it was that stood out to me while you were talking there. So let's say that Hospers' perspective on what's going on with the subconscious is completely correct, except that it's not the full story. Right? The subconscious is trying to affect your decisions and your choices, and it's sending messages to your brain. But like you pointed out, all of the libertarians are saying, yeah, there's a whole great deal of stuff like that going on to determine what a man does. But occasionally, in just the right circumstances, he has the ability, as he feels he does, to say no to all of his inclinations, including his subconscious ones. And Hospers didn't feel the need to do any argumentative work to combat that. He just sort of said, well, the psychoanalyst will tell you that this is all there is to being a person. Well, the psychoanalyst is only allowed to consider those aspects of being a person in order to do his psychoanalyses. So he didn't really prove anything. It's just he has to make that assumption to do the other things he does, which, as you also pointed out, are somewhat dubious and maybe just so stories. So all of those, I think, are really good criticisms. On your Freud point, I would say the category I put Freud in myself, for what that's worth, is he's one of the individuals who is enlightening even when he's wrong. And there's a whole lot of people liking to look down on Freud because they notice what he got wrong, or they've discarded things that he got wrong. And that's, it's right that they recognize in their science, the development and everything. But the core of what Freud got right is this entire subconscious thing. So all of the psychoanalysts who are saying, well, he was sort of onto something, but he got a lot wrong. It's like, well, what did he get right? Well, he got right what invented my entire field and what everybody agrees on, no matter whether or not they're an alternative camp to Freud or not. He got that right, which is that basically the idea that you're not aware of all the things going on in your head, which, of course, philosophers know that Socrates was aware of that. And we'll talk about the fact that, maybe there's a way of understanding that Freud didn't exact. I mean, there's a great many philosophers who were explicitly aware of that for a very long time. But in any case, Freud made it something that was, he took a completely unacceptable idea in public and made it something that by the time you're a small child now. everybody knows that you're not aware of all your thoughts and what's motivating you. And so he radically changed the world. So I would put Freud in the category of people who feel the need to look down on him are maybe a little insecure. Freud is enlightening even when he's wrong, and he's worth reading. Okay, so that's the only other comment I wanted to make, but I thought those were really good insights and criticisms that you had here of Hospers. I think that in my perspective, the psychoanalytic evidence is a lot stronger than the Paul Ray determinist assumption of a universal principle that just has to be true for all science. But I do think all of your criticisms are well-founded. And I think what it highlights is that most of these determinists sort of think that libertarians generally think we're free all the time, when in reality, most libertarians think we're not really that free most of the time, but agency is still a thing that can manifest in the universe. And that's all they need to prove, is that a person can occasionally act in a way that's opposite to all their inclinations.
I have a biased theory I wanted to float. If it's the right time, I don't want to interrupt here.
Please, no, that's a perfect time.
Okay, so I noticed that this reading, as I'm reading it, I'm seeing that it's quite comprehensible, at least to, my mind. And I think of who else was easy to read, Paul Ray. So I'm thinking, okay, these are both hard determinists. They're pleasurable to read for my dim-witted self, and I'm thinking it's like, okay, my first impulse is like, great, finally somebody I can freaking understand, and it's like points to these guys for just stating it clearly. But there's another part of me that questions that, and I'm thinking, okay, what if it's simple to read because it's simplistic. It's like such a simplistic view of the world, and maybe it's also not, it hasn't been hammered out with rigor, with intellectual rigor, the way that some others might think. Like, and this, it might also be because the sample size is small, because I believe I think it was only 2 of the 3 hard determinists wrote this way. That's very simple, but also Schlick, although he's not a hard determinist, I guess he I get this impression that, I don't know, I see there's some relation between the hard determinists and the compatibilists, and I think there's this, I might have this wrong, but I feel like there might be, at least obviously for the the logical positivists, at least for them, they dismiss metaphysics. They don't see the point of this. But at the same time, I guess William James also sort of doesn't. So
sure,
I don't know.
It's very different. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, I think those are really fair reflections for sure. Look, I'll confess to let's say, an intellectual bias, an intellectual instinct. I don't know. One of the things that's attractive about libertarianism is that you figure it's got to be harder to prove. It's got to be a harder position to hold, and so it's more intriguing. So about the first thing you said, there's two things, right? One thing we don't want to do is make something complicated that's actually quite simple, right? So sometimes the role of the intellectual or the academic is to say things are a lot simpler than you're pretending they are. And often the role of the intellectual or the scholar is to say, no, things are a lot more complicated than you realize. And so, the question is, which way does the tug of rope need to be pulled more? I think you're right. The determinists, one of the things that seems intellectually lacking is that they're unaware of the fact that they're asserting statements of faith. They don't really think they have to prove. I want to just turn the sound off on my phone if you'll bear with me. I'm really going to have to try to get in the habit of doing that before we start. All right. Is that they're sort of asserting this is the way to think, this is my bias. This is the way I prefer to think. They're not really even proving it's the only way to think. And then they're saying, well, let me show how you can follow to the logical conclusions from these assumptions. It's like, okay, great, but you didn't even write a sentence to argue for those assumptions. And there is something rather simplistic. I don't know what's going on with this. Hold on. I think I agree with you. There's something too simple about that. So I think those are good instincts. That's all I can say, is that they're just instinctive reflections that you're having there. And I share them with you. And I think that they make sense, that there's something about the determinists that's intellectually rigorous and impressive in some ways, because they're following the conclusions bravely and courageously and lead and seeing where they lead. But they don't really feel, at least the ones we've read so far, they don't really feel the need to demonstrate their starting point is valid. And I think that shines through. I mean, I think it just looks, in light of William James, it looks embarrassing, because William James is saying, no, the libertarians and the determinists are expressing statements of faith. And you couldn't possibly resolve a question like this scientifically, because it's about worlds other than our own. It's about the reality of possibilities. And science can only look at the data of what happens, not what might have happened, and tell us the nature of what might have happened, if it's real or impossible. And so for whatever, forgetting the argument, I think he's right that you can see it in Paul Ray, and you can see it in Hospers. And it's not to dismiss either of them or to say that that's true of every determinist, but they really don't feel the need to do more than just say, I assert determinism, now let's see where it leads. Oh, it leads to we're not free. Well, bravo for being brave enough and intellectually honest enough to follow to that conclusion. But I think the virtues of what you're doing might end there intellectually. Okay, what was else? All right, so let's do this. Okay, so wait, back to the first thing you said one more time, which is sometimes people convolute, they muddy the waters, they make things more complicated than they really are, so that you get confused, and then you think, well, I guess the guy talking must be right. And you see lesser minds do that every day on Twitter. People who fancy themselves intellectual love that trick. But it's also a problem that we can fall into without realizing it. And so that's one side of things. And then the other side of things is to say, it's simpler than it is, when really there's more going on, and you haven't really demonstrated that it's all reducible. And I think one of the intellectual instincts that makes people oversimplify things, and if the determinists are guilty of that, or if the ones we've read are guilty of that, then I think that the impulse is something like, the world has to be something that I can make sense of. And sort of a commitment to get to a place where the world they're describing is something that other people could agree to because it makes sense, and a disinclination to take up the kind of burden that they would actually have to take up intellectually to really demonstrate that their starting assumptions are correct. That's the reflections I feel towards what you're saying. I think that's pretty correct. Anybody else want to say anything about this Hospers before we go on to the questions? Okay, let's see what questions we have here. Why does Hospers talk so fatally about the control of the subconscious in neurosis? Because he's a psychiatrist. He believes that neuroses start in early childhood and nothing can be done to stop their influence or bring healing or freedom from their control. Because he believes that only perfectly psychologically healthy people can ever truly be said to be free in their choices. Or because he is illustrating how much control the subconscious has over our behaviors, and this is more easily seen, though no stronger true, in the mentally ill than in the healthy. Would it help if I showed the questions and the answer choices? Let's see if I can do that without breaking everything. Pretty soon I'll have the cable I need to plug directly into the Wi-Fi, or the internet. So we'll be able to share things without them breaking. Bear with me.
Yeah, that might help.
Let's try and see what we can do here. Okay, Hospers. So why does he talk so fatally about this, the control of the subconscious in neurosis? So let's read it carefully, because he may say more than one of these things, but what's the reason why he's bringing it up in the first place? How is he using this to make his argument? As a psychiatrist, he believes that neuroses start in early childhood, and nothing can be done to stop their influence or bring healing or freedom from their control. Because he believes that only perfectly psychologically healthy people can ever truly be said to be free in their choices. Or because he is illustrating how much control the subconscious has over our behaviors. And this is more easily seen, though no stronger, in the mentally ill than in the healthy.
Should I vote here?
Go for it.
I will say the last one.
I think that's right. So the reason why this question is useful is because he does say a lot of these other things. We want to know why he's saying what he's saying, and we also want to not imagine he's saying something other than he is. So as a psychiatrist, he does believe that neuroses start in early childhood. But if he believed that nothing could be done to stop their influence or bring healing or freedom from their control in the extent that they're neuroses. So he may think there's no such thing as freedom from the subconscious, but he does think that you can be free from the neuroses, or else, well, why would he be a psychiatrist? I mean, how could he help anybody? All right, he'd just be a fatalist and chuck it up to, something that can't be changed. So even though he thinks that, okay, so let's go to the next one. Because he believes that only perfectly psychologically healthy people can ever truly be said to be free in their choices, he brings up that idea as something a psychiatrist might say. He says some psychiatrists will say, look, if you're free of your neuroses, then you're freer than you were before, and you've regained your responsibility, you've regained your freedom. But then he says, but the truth is that your subconscious is always reigning supreme. So you are free of your neuroses, and that's a good thing, but you're never free of your subconscious. For him, it's answer 3. Your subconscious has total control over everything you're doing, and your rational faculty, maybe it plays a role occasionally, but it doesn't ever make any important decisions for you. And what it does instead is it's constantly coming up with just so stories, with rationalizations to explain why you did what your subconscious made you do. And the purpose of his essay is to show that we're not free in this way. So I would agree with you on that. All right, Hospers draws a distinction between the right to punish versus responsible. He's not the first to do this. Let's check all that are correct. He does this in order to preserve the notion that society, made of slaves to their subconsciouses, has a right to keep itself safe from the slaves of their subconsciouses who would be compelled to do harm to others. So even though we're not really making our decisions, society has a right to protect itself, as Path pointed out, a protectivist theory of punishment. And, you have the right to do that, even though you're not free and the criminal's not free. Should we check that or no?
I would check that.
Agreed. He is primarily concerned with a deeper notion of moral responsibility, which he thinks that science, the science of psychiatry, can show us does not really exist. So Hospers draws a distinction between the right to punish versus responsible. Okay, so in other words, he's bringing up this right to punish and all of that sort of thing because he's trying to draw a line and say, look, I'm not touching that sort of a thing. I'm trying to talk about moral responsibility. And so he's just drawing the distinction so that he can stick to the topic.
I think I would check that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that's correct. He's not writing a paper on legal theory, philosophy of law or something like that. He's just saying, look, I'm not talking about that. Don't worry, that still exists. Let's move on. He's handling an anticipated objection of some sort or a misinterpretation of what he's saying. He believes that no one has a right to judge or punish anyone else for their bad behaviors because those behaviors are compelled by their subconscious in ways that they could not help.
I would.
That's a negative, right? I mean, I wouldn't check
Yeah,
that. Did he say that?
yeah, that's a
No,
negative.
I think you're right, Path. We'll leave that one open.
Yeah, that's a ludicrous statement.
I think that's right. I mean, he's saying the opposite, right? He's saying the reason he brought it up is to say, no, you can still punish and judge and all of that. It's necessary and everything. But on the deeper level, the level of the conversation I want to have, the question that matters to all of us and the libertarians and everybody, on that level, there's no such real thing as responsibility. But that's not why he's bringing up the right to punish, because he's trying to say, well, therefore you can't punish anyone, which even Paul Ray said that, although Paul Ray, it's harder to see that Paul Ray really thinks that punishment is justifiable ultimately in any way. All right. Understanding this distinction from the previous question, so that we understand that distinction, what is left of the idea of responsibility, which Hospers wants to rid us of? So this is no wrong answers. This is just select whichever ideas you think are correct. So on this one, arguments can be made for checking them. So what we'll do is we'll read them and we'll say, okay, Hospers got rid of this idea of, I've separated it from punishment. Now I'm talking about responsibility the way a libertarian wants it to be. And so if anybody wants to check one, then be prepared to tell us why that's appropriate. So what else beyond just that one notion does he think he wants to get rid of that doesn't really exist? And the first answer could be nothing. He's arguing against an empty idea at that point. The only notion of responsibility that we have ever cared about, according to him, is the idea of who should go to jail or be punished for their crime. If that idea is left intact, some esoteric or metaphysical concept of blame attachment beyond guilty and therefore sent to jail is just silly talk. Would that be something that Hospers would say, that there's no other notion beyond when we talk
No,
about moral? Go ahead. No?
no. Well, that's not what he's. I don't think that's what he said.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I would agree with you on no. Who does that sound more like?
Well, that sounds like a somewhat a few of the previous authors that we've read, because they kept arguing this point that left out a third factor, that the punitive versus trying to um, punitive punishment, or trying to punish people to deter their behavior, when really, and I brought this up before, and I think multiple of us did maybe, is that the society has a right to um, incarcerate people that are bad for the society, especially if they do so repeatedly. And that's where the whole notion of morality kind of comes from, in a way, because people are social animals, or
Yeah,
beings,
I
to be
think.
more accurate,
Yeah, I think
maybe.
Schlick wants to say when we're talking about moral responsibility, that's all we're ever talking about. That's all the idea ever meant. And Hospers is saying, no, the idea means more than that. It's just not true. You don't actually have that kind of freedom. But Schlick, so while Schlick is a compatibilist who says, look, we can be determinists and believe in the right to punish because we found the motive, the person who contained the motive for the action we want to see less of. Hospers isn't doing that. Hospers is saying, no, of course, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about actual agency. That's something totally different. And he says that idea is still intact. We have to separate that from this punishment idea. That's not even what the libertarians are talking about. And then he says, but that thing that you want, you don't really have. It's all your subconscious and you have no control over it. So I think I would agree with you. We would leave that one blank. All right, maybe Hospers thinks everything is left. Freedom is much more than just you have a right to punish me for acting the wrong way. It is the source of all of our pride and shame. It guides our concepts of ourselves, and we could not live without modeling ourselves as responsible agents. So maybe I went too far with that last sentence. But so what do you think? Do we think that Hospers thinks beyond just punishment, there's an idea of freedom that really matters to people? That pride and shame, blameworthiness, and laudability are all things that apply to our actions beyond just the punishment and reward dynamic of those things.
I, to be honest, didn't get a strong impression one way or the other from him on this. Maybe I didn't absorb that part, but it seemed like he wasn't focused on this a whole lot. Maybe I'm
Yeah,
wrong.
I think maybe this is a badly written question. I think the idea is simply that, yeah, he thinks there's something more to it, and maybe that's what he's talking about, but he thinks that we don't have that. If you rightly understood what makes a person do what they do, it's things that happened to them when they were 2, and you really shouldn't be blaming them, and they should take no pride in it. But that's the idea he's trying to knock off. A great deal is left, and Hospers is right to smash that remaining monster with his hammer. Okay, so yeah, so I guess I was saying that he agreed with the thing. Most of us go around with an unnecessary added notion of blame or responsibility that we callously attach to people for actions that they could not help but do. I'm with Hospers. Let's lock up dangerous people and leave off there. No need to set ourselves up as judge all the time, especially when people can hardly help what they do. All right, I think it's pretty clear that, I think we should just move on. I think that was a badly crafted question. Let's hope this one's better. Hospers believes that you are not responsible for your natural inclinations. You didn't choose to be born as you are. And that you are not responsible for what happens to you in the first 3 to 5 years of your life. And that those two taken together account for just about all of your behaviors, all that are significant at least. Which of the following ideas best describes your response to this take of his? So we sort of just had this discussion a second ago, but I want anybody to jump in the second you hear something that sounds closest to what you think. It seems mostly correct to me that Hospers is right. I imagine that psychiatry has developed, and he might not be correct in all the particulars, but whatever science has to say to us about why we make our decisions, so long as that science agrees that we are not conscious of what goes into that decision making, as long as that holds, that we're not conscious of what goes into our decision making, we're not really responsible in the sense that Hospers argues. I wonder if we might just absorb all this new psychiatric knowledge and think of ourselves not as conscious captains of our lives, but as, like Hospers says, the result of a battle between subconscious motivations. Perhaps if we all learned this psychology, we would have a better understanding of ourselves, and our notions of our freedom and responsibility would not be abolished, but would be sophisticated and updated with this new understanding. So it's not very clear of how we might do that, but this idea is, well, why don't we just admit that the psychiatrists are true, are correct, but I don't see what the challenge is to our freedom. We just have to now recognize ourselves as something like a Mount Olympus of warring subpersonalities, and there might still be room for a Zeus in charge to put everything in order or something like that.
I'd say I'm more aligned with that.
All right, so we've got some options there. I mean, if you all take this independently, we can use it as a poll. All right, this situation seems hopeless. If what he says is true, the only hope that we are free is that psychology is nonsense. I believe that we're free and that psychology is nonsense. Okay, so this is different from the last one. It says, look, if Hosper's correct, then we're definitely not free. There's no way to synthesize the truths of psychiatry. We either have to reject psychiatry and have our freedom, or we have to just finally admit, fine. I wasn't convinced by Paul Ray, but damn it, Hospers, I guess I'm really not free. Or we could say the situation seems hopeless. If what he says is true, the only hope that we are free is that psychology is nonsense. I believe that we're not free and that psychology is largely correct. All right, so we could either reject psychology here and believe we're free, or we could reject freedom and believe psychology is correct. Or we could say, I don't think that's the whole story. I could absorb and incorporate everything you're saying about the subconscious and still have a model where freedom can be compatible with that, something like that.
Yeah, I'm probably closest to that one.
Yeah. I think, yeah. Okay, that's good. All right, now here's a weird one. Let's try this. Imagine a student says, well, if a crocodile routinely ate children from a nearby village, I would call the beast responsible and evil. If a person is born narcissistic, as Hospers says some people are born with a large dose of narcissism, I feel they are responsible for their evil actions. I don't understand why we worry so much about proving responsibility beyond that. As if I have to get into the head of the psychopath and ask myself, what if I wanted to not be like this, but I couldn't help it? We don't have access to that. I feel free and I assume others to be responsible. So maybe I could have worded that a little bit better. I wrote this a long time ago, but the idea would be something like, all I'm concerned with as far as your responsibility is, are you the sort of monster that causes trouble that I want to oppose? Right. So it might be making the Schlick camp mistake or correct move. It might be making the Schlick move and saying, well, let's just reduce our moral responsibility notions to ideas of what's right to punish. But I think it's actually different than that, right? He's asserting at the end, I feel free and I assume others to be responsible for what they do. I think they're like me, and I have this internal instinct and impression that my choices are mine. It's sort of a radical embrace of determinism, this perspective here, where it says, I'm going to embrace it so much that it becomes a tautology and it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. In other words, what if it's just the rules of the game, but within the game, I oppose you because of your nature, and your nature is evil. And I don't really need to think that there's a part of your nature that wishes it was different than it is, but can't help it. I just, this is basically the opposite instinct of pretty much every libertarian and determinist we've looked at. They would all say, well, an animal's not responsible. It's just a robot. And the determinists would say people are the same, and the libertarians would say we're different. But this is sort of saying, well, I don't know why you think you've made animals into robots just because there are rules that make them be the thing they are. Maybe that's incoherent, but what do you guys think about somebody who might think something like that? It might sound idiotic, actually.
Am I correct that that's like most aligned with Schlick's idea?
Yeah, I think it's trying to not be Schlick, but it might be Schlick against its will, right? So the student who might have this perspective is trying not to be Schlick, but maybe just is, even though he doesn't want to be. So Schlick's idea is all we ever cared about with morality was finding out who to punish in a deterministic sense. This person is saying, no, what I care about morality is about identifying the praiseworthy or blameworthy types, not just in the dimension of encouraging or discouraging their future actions, but as models to motivate my emulation and development of the character I think I have, right? It's more at least trying to emphasize characterological agency, but maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it just falls into what Schlick is actually saying, and it can't quite get out of it. And I think that's what the next response from the next student says is, the crocodile idea proves exactly why we are not free. No one would say that the crocodile deliberated. He just ate out of instinct. If we are like that, then Hospers has little left to prove, I think. So you might agree with that one too, as well as the above one that more nearly fits your position. Well, we had just as good a discussion without those questions, I noticed, before we ended up getting to the questions. So we didn't exactly need them to do what we did just now. But I think they were interesting.
Yeah, it can help delineate what's going on.
When I crafted the questions, the idea was to try to supplement the sorts of things you would hear from other students if they were intelligent and engaged students, and try to rebuild a classroom setting in this digital format. Hey, how do you like the new studio? It's not finished yet, but we've got stacks of books that you can't see past my fat body over there, and there's some fun things going on. It'll be done in a few more weeks.
I noticed that. So it seems like you're what's that? On budget and ahead of schedule, as Trump says.
Yeah.
Under budget, ahead of schedule.
Actually, we just put $2,000 into this, and it's all going to be delivered in the next 2 weeks, actually a week and a half now. So it's going to be even more fun soon. Yeah, we're ahead of schedule and budget. under budget and ahead of schedule. So
I like
that's
it. Looks good. The candle adds a nice flavor to it.
yeah. I like the sense of the candles. I smoke so much I can barely smell and taste compared to other people anymore. But I like the scented
No, it's
candle.
looking good. Getting some character in there. I like the book holder as well.
Oh, hey, thank you. Yeah, I started making some stacks. I got 10 copies of Scott Adams' new Reframe Your Brain book over there on top of the pile of psychology and persuasion books that most of them are what he recommends.
Definitely gonna have to play a song for us at some point.
No, I might not have to do that. I've played songs in the mythology class or the mysticism class for Rumi.
Oh.
I'm not sure how well it went. I'm not much of a
Wait, what?
musician.
You're gonna? What? Hold on. What'd you say? Are you gonna play a song for us?
I wasn't planning on it. Sorry, I'll play a YouTube video of a song maybe. All right, so that's a fun topic. Savad, what did you think about this psychoanalytic approach?
It was, it was interesting how he was saying that basically, was it when somebody, by the time that they turned 5, that they had, what did he say? He was referring to their subconscious?
Yeah, the game's over at 5, according to him.
Right. And there was the example of the woman who was on the train with her baby. It was really cold. And the operator said, "Hey, you better get off the next stop. Your baby's going to die." And she was headstrong and decided to continue on her way, and her baby died. And his point was that it was to the neurosis, correct?
Yeah, that her subconscious resented the child, convinced her it was important to get to the destination because consciously she couldn't have entertained the idea that she was trying to kill her child. But she had no control over the fact that the subconscious was going to express what it was going to express. And then she wept and mourned and grieved over her dead child and felt guilt and shame and what a horrible mother she was. But she did the thing that she did because of her subconscious and she wasn't aware of it. That was his picture of how we all are.
I mean, as ridiculous as that can sound, man, that shit happens.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth. Yeah.
And then someone will rationalize after the fact.
I agree completely.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, there's some validity to that. It made me think about, remember I provided some notes to the class and I was talking about a baby. And you're like, what the hell does this guy keep talking about babies for? And it was, he made and it was just to present the point that, right, as a baby, you're reliant on your parents and you don't have freedom, right? Or it's limited. You don't know what the hell is going on. And he talked about that as well, correct?
Yeah. I mean, he says everything that determines what you are in your behavior when you're older happens to you before you're 5. Now that might not be true, but it's more true than people who think it's completely untrue think.
Well, man, talk about people who have issues and talking about getting in touch with their inner child. And a lot of that can be these traumatic experiences of the fear of dogs. It's probably when you're a little kid, and you felt defenseless or intimidated or scared, and that had this imprint and kind of had molded that model that you had on, dogs, which may not be the most, what you could say is, oh, all right, it was one time this dog, right? But you're talking about this experience, this imprint that somebody had on you. I mean, there's some validity in truth that I think, I mean, I don't know at 5, but I think, as I had said, a lot of these issues that even adults have with is when they were kids, and it's like they forget about it and they gloss over it, whether it's abuse, and that fucks people up, right?
Agreed.
So that's something I certainly can't ignore.
Oh yeah, I agree.
With that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, so I think there's some, I think there's some truth to that, and even I think it is even, I don't know, I'd have to read it, but hypnotists also say that your subconscious is kind of set at a very, very young age, and maybe not that young, but when you're being persuasive, to write at a 5th grade level, to make it very short, very simple, persuading people, because what you're doing is, right, you're talking to their subconscious to have an impact.
So I think it's even worse than we've been saying, right? So it's not that the child forgets about it; it's that they don't even have the ability to form memories yet. What's happening to them is shaping the sort of entity that they are when they start forming memories.
Right, and you're right about that. Sorry to interrupt, but they might not have these memories until later in life, and be like, "Holy shit!"
If at all, yeah.
Right, like, and I have, like, friends, family, where this is, like, it's happened, where they have realized something has happened to them later in life, and it was fine, and then whatever triggered or opened it up, and one day they were like, holy shit, like, this, I experienced this, I didn't remember it, now I am remembering it for whatever reason, and it's something that they have to grasp and deal with.
So without getting into anyone's particulars, let's talk generally about this. So there's a few things to think about. One, let's go back to your example of the dog. You have an experience with a dog when you're 2 or 3, and it's barking in your face, and you're confronted with a vision of viciousness, and you brought up the idea that now maybe you have a distorted view of dogs the rest of your life. But that's not really what's happening, or that is happening. But what's happening on a deeper level is you've just confronted the vicious as such, the chaotic unknown, the fact that there are images impressed upon your mind of a world with entities that might be out to get you. And so the impression might be something more like, my parents can't keep me safe, or I'm not safe, or no one really cares what happens to me, or something's out to get me. Like that deeper impression has to do with more than just canines. Although I'm sure small children identify the kind of
right. It becomes more of a generalization.
So
yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So it's the situation's worse. It's as bad as you think it is. It's worse than we've even been able to put into words so far. So here's two. Let me give a less interesting of the two interesting philosophical things to consider there, and then let's talk about a more serious one. So the first one is this: how much are we determined at the age of 3 by what happens to us? Well, the psychoanalytic tendency is to say, well, this happened to you and therefore you're like this. But the same thing happens to lots of people and they don't turn out the same. I think to myself with the nature versus nurture debate, what happens to you doesn't determine what you are, it reveals what you are, right? You've known people who've had absolutely horrifying upbringings, and yet they're moral champions. They're incredibly courageous and brave people who are completely in control of themselves and highly accomplished. And then you know other people who have had a silver spoon in their mouth their whole life, and they stub their toe when they're in their young adulthood, and it's the end of the world and they never get over it. And it's like, no one can ever do enough for them. It's like, okay, is what's happening to you making you what you are? Or is it revealing the unique struggles that you're going to have to face with based on what you are, with a world that is, something to wrestle with. It's a thing that brings struggle.
Right, because you have the choice in how you react, in how you handle something. I mean,
well, maybe when you're 2 or 3, you might not even have the choice. It might just be that
that's true.
You're determined by what you are and what happens to you. And what happens to you develops and reveals and activates your character rather than determines your character. But you're still, that model could still fit with Hospers determinism, because you didn't choose to have the DNA you have either. But at least it adds a level of complexity that the psychoanalytic approach often sees, but is inclined to miss, which is this idea of, let me just figure out what happened when you were 2, and that explains everything. Well, it's like, well, it's half the story. What happened to you when you were 2? So we're going to have to talk about the more complicated one, because the first one's not going to fully make sense until we talk about this other issue. So let's talk about this other issue. There's another way of looking at how to be in the world. So the psychoanalytic approach is, psychology is maybe, although it's the subject I've studied the least of the ones I'm willing to talk about, it's the one I think is most interesting. And part of the reason why it's most interesting is that it has one foot squarely in data-based formula science, and the other foot squarely in mythopoetic dream language. And those two are the most incompatible languages, and yet there are psychoanalysts like Freud who are trying to interpret dreams. There are psychologists like Jung who's gone well beyond that into the realm of prophecy and visions and things like that. And then there's behavioralists on the far other side. Even Freud's, and dreams are things that happen to you. Dreams are experiences. Dreams are a character is going through a thing. They're not at all the language of formula. And even though Freud does interpretive methods, he never says, well, X means Y, and this is how we can interpret it all, like in some sort of science. He's in that direction compared to Jung, but he's still on that side of things. Whereas there's psychoanalysts who basically say, we're all identifiable types of robot, and the things that happen to you determine what you are, and we'll measure it based off your behavior. So what's cool about psychology is that it's sort of crucified between these two incompatible approaches, which I think makes it the king of all the sciences, perhaps. But we can talk about that some other time. So let's talk about this other language for a second and say, the idea that you are a character wrestling with the darkest things that you have to wrestle with in order to triumph. In order to get from A to B, you have to have sort of a godlike, hero-like approach, is the story of it's one of the core stories of every religious text, right? You've got Marduk. What is he doing? He's facing the thing that seems too dark to face. You're talking about facing things that you can't face the first time they happen to you when you're too young, and then having to face it in order to make sense of things and to not be crippled by them anymore. Most of the psychoanalytic approaches that have been successful all basically follow that type of formula. So in mythology, you've got stories of, leave the village, right? Leave the place where your family is and your community is and where the walls are, where all of the rules are understood, and go into the wild outside places, climb a mountain and slay a dragon. Okay, that's saying face the darkest thing possible. Triumph over it because it's hoarding gold. It has the value and the riches that you need to thrive and succeed in life, and then bring them back and distribute them amongst the village. So it's also what the culture itself needs, is the individual hero to do this, for it to be revived and updated, and not to stagnate into sort of mass neurosis and group neurosis. Okay, I'm not saying all of that's true. I'm saying that's a story, and it's the oldest written story we have, and it's the story of King George, and it's the story of Apollo and Python. It's a story that's sort of one of the core stories in all of the narrative mythopoetic frameworks, which are, by the way, whatever they are, so powerful that they took poop-throwing, rock-wielding apes and turned them into pyramid builders and cathedral builders, right? So I don't know. I know that... Well, the idea of propositional truth is not the same thing as narrative truth, but it seems to me that whatever is in there might be called truth if what it does is allow characters like us to succeed as well as we did when we were tree-dwelling apes before we had dreams and stories like these that we oriented ourselves around. That's an oversimplification, but it's a suggestion that we might consider. But what's interesting about that suggestion is that it takes into account the challenge that the psychoanalysts, at least the Hospers ones, and like I said, most psychoanalytic theories, the camps of thought for clinical psychologists to say this is how you help a person who's in trouble, all of them in one way or another are about facing the thing that you think is too scary to look at in one way or another. So we were telling ourselves those stories. This is a lot of stuff from year 2, but why don't we just do part of it? There's a famous story about what happens when you throw a rubber snake into a cage of chimpanzees. Have you heard this? I think Peterson told this story once, so it's out there in a pretty popular format.
Go for it.
Okay, well, I'll retell it. So you throw a rubber snake into a cage of chimpanzees, and what happens is the chimpanzees immediately leap to the top of the cage and cling to the cage and try to get as far away from the snake as they possibly can. And they all refuse to look at the snake because the snake is too terrifying to look at. And they scream. And when they're screaming, the part of their brain that is activated while they're screaming is the same part of your brain that's activated when you're swearing. So it turns out swearing has a unique or a specific neurological subroutine that gets activated only when you're cursing, which is why people feel that cursing is a pretty powerful thing to do in one way or another. So it's activating some part of your brain different than regular speech. In any case, that's what they're doing. They're climbing to the top of the cage and they're going, fuck, 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 something like that. But you can't do that forever. And eventually you're going to get bored if you try. But they'll do it for a long time. But one of them will get bored first. And what happens when he gets bored first is look, I'm not dead. It's like a little bit of rationality seeps in. It's like, I'm not getting out of this cage, but I've been screaming for a long time, and I'm also not bit yet. So the thing I thought was going to happen didn't happen. Maybe I should take a look and see if it's still there. Oh, it's still there. But it's still not biting me. So I take a look. And so the first ape to get bored enough or courageous enough to start looking at the thing starts paying attention to the fact that it isn't moving. And, it's still a pretty damn scary thing for a primate to confront a snake, right? When we talk about slaying a dragon, what we're talking about is the thing that is, too terrifying to look at. It's there to eat you. I think Jung, it's the archetype of the predator. Okay. It's the thing that has power over you, and you need to make yourself small and hide. It's all those instincts. So eventually the bored or courageous ape looks at it and starts looking at it longer while everyone else is screaming, fuck, fuck, fuck. And, that's doing what it's doing to its psychology. But it starts to get curious about the snake. Now, that's a really cool movement. It gets curious about what is this thing? that, I'm pretty sure I knew what it was. It's the thing that was going to kill me, but it hasn't. So what's going on down there? And then maybe eventually it'll drop a rock or a stick on it and think, oh, that'll get it to come after me, but I may as well do something. Like, there's no way out of this, checkmate. So let's see what happens. And then, of course, it doesn't move because it's a rubber snake. And so the chimpanzee starts to get the idea that maybe this thing isn't just going to fly up like a dragon, which is basically what the model of, okay, so this is cool. It's acting as though the snake is going to fly up at it like a dragon. That's what the snake is in the chimpanzee's mind, right? And of course, you've heard before that there's a group of psychologists who do, I can't remember what they call it, but basically it's poll taking. And they take polls of people, they ask them questions in different languages all around the world to try to get data on human universals and other things like that. And I think they discovered that 7-year-olds all around the world dream about dragons. Even in a few cultures where there aren't any stories about dragons, they dream about flying, fire-breathing snake birds. The archetypal predator is a thing that exists inside the mind of primates. And the chimp is acting as though that thing is coming at him, but he drops a stick on it and nothing happens. And he starts to think, I'll drop another stick. Maybe I'll go closer to it and I'll be ready to run away. But the other monkeys might still be screaming. Maybe I'll poke it with a stick and run and see what happens. Eventually, the chimpanzee realizes that it's a rubber snake. I mean, he doesn't know what rubber is, but he realizes that the thing is not what he thought it was, that it was something he could face. And then the real funny part is that what happens after that is that the chimpanzee has power in the community that no one else has. And what he typically does is he picks up the rubber snake and chases the rest of the chimpanzees around the cage, laughing at them, right? So he's got the power of the snake. Let's put that aside for a second. In the Apollo story, Apollo slays Python. Python is, again, the image of, it's not on Parnassus's airy height. Apollo creates the space for the higher muses and higher culture. And so the poets and all of those other things, he's the god of imperialism and Supreme Courtism and medicine and science, because he's going in to face the things we don't know. Like, what do all these plants do for good or ill? And he cuts them into pieces and he figures out what they are. So he's the god of that. And he slays Python and creates the space where we can live more freely because we're not victims of snakes anymore, to a degree, that idea. Okay. But Apollo's temple is the temple where the oracle at Delphi pronounced Socrates the wisest man in Athens. And in Apollo's temple, you can see Apollo's throne. And you can see the lantern that the priests would use for oil and stuff to worship Apollo and to tend to his altars and stuff. And his throne has snakes in it. And there's a story where he sends serpents against an enemy of his to consume him and to consume 3 of his enemies, father and sons. And the lantern has a sort of a dragon image on it. And the idea, the image idea, the Jungian, if we're going to do psychology, we can bring up a little Jung today. The Jungian archetypal idea is that idea. It's the idea that if you face the thing that is so terrifying, it's got you like this your whole life. If you actually go into the forest at the place that seems darkest, right? If you go and face the thing you think you can't face, you win everything. Like, you win what you need in order to triumph over the things that were beating you down. If you triumph over it, you may discover that it's something that you could face. Because, of course, anything that you can't face, think of those other chimpanzees. If I won't look at it, what it is everywhere. It's everywhere I can't look, or it's everywhere I refuse to look. So the dragon gets bigger and seems more monstrous because I'm refusing to look at it. Whatever it is, it might be pretty monstrous, right? It might be a pretty horrible goddamn thing to face, and it might be really rough to look at. But it's definitely not as big as everywhere that I'm not looking. But as long as you refuse to look at it, that's how big it is. It's much bigger if it's everywhere you refuse to look. And so what I'm trying to suggest, although, this is a whole bunch of other classes that we'll be doing in year 2, really rapidly, what I'm trying to summarize and suggest here is that for 250,000 years, we eventually built civilizations, all of which were oriented around understanding or misunderstanding to different degrees, stories like that, which basically said to us, you're the type of creature that will be crippled and incapable of advancing things forward unless you face the thing that seems too terrifying to you. After we started orienting ourselves around those stories, and there's other counter stories and balances. I mean, Daphne is the opposite hero. It's the Christ hero. It's the Socratic hero, which is also a thing that needs to be known. So this isn't the full story, even from the mythopoetic perspective, but it's just a glimpse of what we need to look at for our purpose today, is to say, okay, I think science and philosophy were made possible by here's a funny thing that people say about civilization. They say, well, we developed some technology, we eventually started farming, and then we had a caloric surplus, which we had enough food that we didn't have to all be looking for berries all day every day. And so eventually we got to the point where we could relax and we could start to build religions and philosophies and science. I don't think so. I really, honest to God, think that what happened was we started cave painting and we started making statues of little Venuses, and we started orienting ourselves around the image and the impression and eventually the narrative picture of ourselves in the world. And it was close, and the stories got repeated for thousands of years, and only the parts that were memorable got remembered and got passed down. And so the stories got edited, not by a single super brilliant Shakespeare, but they got edited by the cosmos itself, which said this tribe has stories that don't tell its people how to orient themselves in the world well enough to compete with the tribes who have slightly different stories around them. And that's what they meant by we're warring to see whose God is correct kind of thing. And of course, there were tragedies and horrible accidents of nature and things that happened too. So it's not like this was a clean process. And there was also a lot of positive borrowing back and forth and in the stories and everything too between cultures. But in any case, we have this idea that these stories are divinely inspired. Well, that might be the simplest way or the most accurate way of saying no person wrote this. What happened was our species slowly started to become awake to stories that tell us the truth about who we are in the world and how we have to relate to nature and the community and the family and the divine. And that's the purpose of the stories. Now, two more things to say. One, the way those stories talk about who we are is characterologically. It's not propositionally. It isn't saying, sometimes they'll overlap and they'll debate philosophy, and you can have philosophy in scriptural texts and all of that. But the core of those stories is to say, here's a guy, here's what he's like. Let me tell you how I'm going to tell you what he's like. I'm going to have him meet this guy and this girl over here, and he's going to confront this thing. And so it's all characters smashing into each other, and the sparks that fly are what give you the illumination. That's not the same as saying, here's a statement for you to agree to, right? It's before philosophy. It's before science. It's maybe can't do certain things that philosophy and science can do, but it might be much more profound and it can go much further. It's sort of the base foundation, perhaps, upon which those other things can rest and build their foundations. Again, we can't argue to prove any of this. We will argue to try to prove a lot of these claims in year 2 when we talk about this stuff more. But I'll just nakedly say some of these things and say, well, here's a picture of how to think about this. So one of the things to recognize about the mythopoetic approach to things is that it's characterological, which means the knowledge you gain is relational, which means, well, it means a lot of things. One of the things it means is this: if you have a friend and you're very close to that friend, you learn about that friend over time and you get to know them. Every time that you get to know something about them, what happens first is that you're surprised because you assume that you know him because you just make assumptions that he's like you, but you discover something that he's different than you in because you've been surprised. And then you talk it out or you carefully observe and you start to figure out what he's like as a person. This is the same as with your spouse, right? It's all relational. But what's interesting about that is that when you learn something about that person, you're simultaneously learning something about yourself. The reason to point that out is that the knowledge is simultaneous because it's relational, is that the way the mythopoetics conceptualize things. And this is sort of, when I say the way they conceptualize, the way I say their starting point is, what I'm saying is these are the assumptions they have to make to start doing their work. It's exactly parallel to the assumptions that the scientists have to make to start doing their work. It's not that they're arguing that it's the case. It's that this is the way I'm looking at things. Well, the way they looked at things was this relational kind of knowledge, but that's the same as knowledge of the universe, knowledge of nature, knowledge of the divine, knowledge of the community and how you relate to it. It's all the same. This is why they had personalities like Mars and Zeus and Venus. They didn't say psychoanalytic subroutines related to lust. They said Venus, she's a chick. She's like this. She might possess you and you might act in ways different than you would normally act when she's possessing you. You might say to yourself, oh, how could I have done that? Well, you weren't choosing what to do. She was, because she possessed you. Maybe you need to get to know who these characters are, this rage and this lust and these things, because anyone possessed by them looks more like that thing. They look more like each other when they're being possessed than they do like themselves when they're not being possessed. So in other words, the language of the mythopoetic, it might be a much more powerful and accurate way of describing what being is like in a straightforward, simple way. I don't mean simple, but I just mean that might actually be the language that's the most accurate way of describing what it's like to be in the world. And they're concerned with what it's like to be in the world, which is, of course, not what the scientists are concerned with, and the philosophers are in the middle. In any case, I'm going to make too many claims that I'm not going to have time to prove today, and there's going to be a lot of discussions. I promise you this is all we talk about when we start the year 2 stuff, and it's really fascinating and awesome, and there's lots of room for debate. The point of saying all of this is to say the psychoanalysts, the psychologists, I think they're in both realms. I think they're trying their damnedest to do science, and they keep not being able to resist, except for a few camps that are trying to, but by and large, they just can't resist dream, impression, vision, characterological and relational things. And so if the psychoanalysts are doing science at all, if they're doing science, their science is more and more synthesizing with profound truths that may have been the things that we've been thinking all along to try to make sense of being. And the determinist scientific approach to psychoanalysis that sort of makes things objective and following of formulas is not most of psychology. It's a tendency, and an important one, a trend sometimes in psychology, and it needs to you need to deal with it, right? It has something to say. But most of psychology is one camp or another that says you're a character, and in order to thrive, you need to face the darkness in one way or another. And I'll sum it up by saying all of that to say that psychology doesn't seem to me to be suggesting that we're not free. It seems to be suggesting that we need to become free, and that there's ways we can do so, and that we need to go on the hero's journey to become free, which is a lot of what Twilight and Path and Savad have suggested earlier, that there's degrees of freedom and that there's paths to liberation. I think Hospers, after saying a lot of that, he wants to go a little bit further and say, well, ultimately the subconscious is just determining everything. I don't think he gave reasons why we should have to think so. I think that most of psychology and most of the camps in psychology, although they recognize that the subconscious is doing a lot, either some small portion of them recognize that, well, there's something else also going on. There's maybe a communication between the two, and it's very complicated. It's not just this one-sided thing where this is determining things and you're just making up stories. It might be a lot of feedback and communication between the two, which means you're relating to the things that you're unaware of that actually make up what you are. And so there's room in that. In any case, I guess the sum up is just, I don't think psychology forces you into a Hospers view of what it forces you into, even if he may be right. I guess I think that was the main point of what I wanted to say there. And this idea that Savad's talking about facing the darkness is, if it's not true, it's the thing every successful civilization decided to believe was true. Okay, so from a William James pragmatism, that's true enough, or that's what truth means, right? If believing it makes you die, then it wasn't true enough, because what you were trying to understand was how to thrive and move forward in the world. If believing it is the thing that every successful civilization did, so any civilization that believes the opposite isn't around anymore, that could be a very, you might call that a huge amount of cosmic evidence that it's true. if you're inclined to look at it that way and judge it that way. So why don't we open it up to any, I know there's a lot there, and I'll be happy to argue and expound and explain and debate and flush things out there if you want to. If anybody has anything that they want to say before we go to the after show, where we'll do the simultaneous whatever, speak up now or vote that we go to the after show. So anything else you want to say before we stop recording, I guess is what I'm asking. All right.